even ask, they even told me 5 times.
I was remarking earlier that when I was at LSE 60 years or so ago, I used to come over here from time to time because of talks related to the Caribbean and Africa. And the place is looking much spiffier than the muster rooms I used to visit way back when. So, thank you for having me. So, genocide and slavery are unquestionably mankind's two most infamous and heinous crimes. There's now intense growing scholarship and interest in both subjects. But the historiography of slavery is considerably older, not because slavery preceded genocide, as several recent major studies, including most recently the Cambridge World History of Slavery of Genocide, has made clear. Genocide has been with us almost as long as slavery. The first volume is devoted to genocide in antiquity, in the Middle Ages, and in prehistory. And what do you know? It was that crime against humanity is almost as ancient as slavery itself. However, the scholarship on genocide is far more recent, and the very word genocide was coined only in the 40s, as you know, the world became aware of this crime only after the Second World War and the meetings of the United Nations on it, which will have a lot to say later. What I'd like to do is briefly compare, only so brief now, the genocide and slavery, say something about where we're at, or genocide scholars, I should say, are at in understanding what it is. I'll say less about the nature of slavery itself. I've been talking a lot about that recently, but it dawned on me you were not in the previous lectures, so perhaps I shouldn't assume that you know what slavery is. And then I'd like to, in the second part of the talk, go more deeply into the two paradigmatic slave societies of the New World, Jamaica and the United States, and then focus on Jamaica. And I want to argue that Jamaica is a case not only of the most extreme form of plantation slavery in the Americas, possibly in the world, but it's also a case, an instance of genocide. This is where slavery and genocide come together, and my argument will be to try to show you why that is the case. The slavery, let me say, is, as you know, and as very kindly pointed out, has been defined, and most people seem to think of it in terms of the ownership of one person by another. That's not incorrect, but it's just that it's restricted in its application mainly to the slaveries of ancient Rome and the modern Americas. I've tried to argue in Slavery and Social Death that a broader, more encompassing conception of slavery, which is applicable to all slaveholding societies, is one which shifts the focus from ownership as such to one which looks at slavery as a relation of domination, to use a term which Marx used in describing it, in which characterized by three features. The total domination. Domination is common in human life, but total domination, the complete domination of one person by another, is unusual. As Michael Mann, in his Sources of Power book, pointed out, societies always found ways of somehow limiting the totality of power, largely through the intervention of parties who have an interest of one kind or another, familial, political, regional, or what have you, in preventing the total abject domination of one person by another. Slavery is the exception, complete and total domination, which invariably, whatever the laws of the country, amount to the power of life and death over the slave. I've not known a single society in which there are slave laws. Most countries with laws do have some law tucked away somewhere, which says that it's illegal to kill a slave. Well, the problem is if you give a slaveholder the right to punish a slave, then there's always an out if you end up killing the slave, which is say it was an accident. And that was true in ancient Rome. That was true in all the slave societies. In the centuries of U.S. slavery, only, I think, 2 people were ever found guilty of killing their slaves, although hundreds, thousands of slaves were in fact killed. And in the case of Jamaica, of course, no one has ever hung for killing a slave, even though thousands were. So it involves the life of the power of life and death. There's a central feature of slavery, in my view, though, is what I call natal alienation. The alienation from the rights of birth. Everyone belongs to the society in which they're born, or held to belong, and there are certain fundamental rights which go with that. The most important, of course, is one which cannot really be defined in law. It's the fact that you belong to this society, and that carries certain rights, certain privileges. The most important thing about the slave is that they lack that rights. They're deracinated from the society from which they came in cases where slaves were brought from outside the society, but never re-socialized in the society to which they're brought. However, there are cases where locally born people are enslaved. It's unusual in the West, but in fact, the typical slave in many Eastern societies, notably Han China, and especially Korea, which most people are totally aware of this fact, including most Koreans, which had pretty extensive slavery during the Koryo and Yi dynasties, which is most of its history. Most of the slaves were local. And so you had another kind of internal, if you like, denial of natality, and usually quite extensively ritualized, but expressing the fact that this person were like non-human. And finally, slavery as extreme degradation. The slave was a nobody. The slave had no honor to be defended. That had immediate physical implications for slave women. Every slave society amounted to mass rape of women and girls who could be raped with impunity, and of course men could be insulted and because they had no honor to defend. In Germanic lands, it's interesting, where the Wehrgild was highly developed. When a slave was insulted, it's interesting that charges were sometimes brought, but the person who received the Wehrgild payment was the slaveholder, not the slave. It was the slaveholder who was insulted if the slave was abused. So those three factors together constitute something quite unique in human society. The fact that the slave did not belong. And now, the implications of this are really staggering. And I have been quite fascinated to see that the social psychologists have, in their study of what it is that constitutes humanness, especially Susan Fiske at Princeton, but she's drawing on earlier work in which she developed these 5 motives, as she called them, or drives, as they're called in an earlier tradition of psychology, emphasize these 5 fundamental things which constitute what it is to be human. And the fundamental one, and this is so intriguing to me. I mean, I gotten in touch with her and spoken about this, but the fundamental thing about being human is to belong, and have a sense of belonging. Okay? The idea that one is a part of one society. And not to have that is absolutely devastating, because it takes away one of the fundamentals of what it is to be a human being. But that's what natal alienation means. The slave does not belong. And Fiske and other social psychologists have shown that the other fundamental aspects of being human in a sense relates very much to this, as the diagram here illustrates. Being able to make sense of the world, being able to understand one world. Imagine what it's like being a slave. How can you make sense of a world in which you get up each morning at dawn, and every decision about what you do is made by someone else? Being human means, even as a child, I love to hear the sounds of children. Even as a child, you see, little babies begin to protest and assert their will. It's fundamentally human to do that. The sounds they make of and make sense of their world, to control and have competence over one's life, to view oneself as worthy and improvable, and to trust, to be able to trust others. All of those things. And quite independently of this work, I found in exploring what it is to be a slave, are central in their denial to the experience of slavery. So that is what I've emphasized, rather than just the legal definition, which misses much of this. Now, I'm not saying that the legal definition of slavery as property is not important. It does exclude many societies in which, in fact, slaves cannot be sold. In many African societies, slaves, certain categories of slaves were not sold. In Islamic societies, too, if a woman has a child for her slaveholder, she won't be sold. And the son inherits, in many cases, at least according to the Quran, status of free person. So you'd have to exclude most Islamic societies if you stuck rigidly to the Roman civil law and view of slavery as property. Now, genocide. There's been many definitions, attempted definition. Now, there's a distinction has to be made between the legal definition, which emerged in the 1948 convention on genocide, and the broader, more sociological conception, which scholars have found necessary, for reasons I'll explain in a minute. The term was coined by Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer, jurist, in response to the Holocaust, or the Shoah. And he defined it as the crime of destroying national, racial, or religious groups. The UN, in this defining conference, in fact, codified it more precisely in a legally binding document in the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. That is now ratified by 153 states. Some countries took their time. In fact, I think the U.S. didn't really ratify it until 1988, for reasons I'll get to in a minute. The International Court of Justice now considers it a peremptory norm of international law, which admits of no derogation. Even for those who have not ratified it, by the way, the definition is now considered part of general customary international law by the International Court of Justice. So whether your country has ratified it or not, you can be charged with genocide, as the Serbian leaders discovered. So according to this definition, genocide involves any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part ethnical, racial, or religious groups. And that is killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births, and this is an important one, remember this for my argument later, within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And the convention specifies two basic elements: a mental element, defined as the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, or racial ethnic group as such. That term "as such" has major implications for lawyers. And a physical element, which includes the 5 kinds of acts listed above. Now, almost every one of these elements have been contested, but the key one on which there's been a lot of argument is the issue of intent. To what extent is it necessary for mass killings to be considered genocide? The convention holds that there must be a proven intent on the part of the perpetrators to physically destroy, unquote. The kinds of groups specified, which is what gives the crime of genocide its uniqueness. Now, Alex Hinton, among many genocide scholars, is one of those who contests this, and the contestation began almost from the beginning. the the emphasis on intent had a political origin. You may wonder what all the fuss about this intent. Well, the objections and the reservations and the insistence that this be included, because there was a lot of argument. It was taken out and it was put back in. It was taken out and put back in, and finally it was agreed. Now, what was the argument about? Well, the argument came from, or rather, the insistence came from the United States and several of the then colonial powers, because of their fear that if you didn't have intent in there, they would be immediately exposed to a charge of genocide from their blacks. I mean, remember, blacks were still being lynched in America. The colonial powers by any number of outrages, and so on, and so the term intent became absolutely critical to, and also the U.S. is very concerned about its own indigenous population, which should have a ready-made case of genocide. So the intent clause became very important, and in the end, the U.S. and others won out. And which now it's immediately elicited controversy. There's a famous work by Sartre, who, for example, insists that this is nonsense, and wrote at length in an article in New Left Review. I was still, in fact, on the editorial board of New Left Review when this article came out in '68 on genocide. And this is the height of the Vietnam War. And Sartre said, I mean, this is genocide. The carpet bombing of Vietnam, and later on, of course, of Cambodia and Laos, in which hundreds of thousands of people were killed. How can you not call this genocide? And the Americans said, well, because we didn't intend to kill them. And our intention was not to kill the Viet Cong, the Laotians, and the Cambodians, because they were Vietnamese, because they were Laotians, because they were Cambodians. That was not our intent. And so it's not genocide. It's mass killing. Yeah, we admit to that, but it's not genocide. So you begin to see why Sartre, in his brilliant essay, says this is nonsense. I mean, this is playing around. Only a lawyer would take that seriously. But it has remained in the books, and so it's critical to remember that. Another issue with Sartre and others on the left in particular, but and also people on the right, is the question of the targeting killing of political groups, which the convention also excluded. Here, at the insistence not of the U.S. and so on, but of the Soviet Union, for obvious reasons, as you may imagine, because, of course, Stalin's nationalization of land and agricultural policy, which resulted in the mass starvation to death of millions of Russians and Ukrainians. It's memorialized as the Holodomor in Ukraine, because Stalin's policies led to the death by starvation of 4 million, some 12% of the entire Ukrainian population. And again, that's genocide. And the Russians said, no, it's not genocide. And it wasn't genocide. Stalin didn't intend to kill Ukrainians as such. As such. Maybe as peasants and so on, he accidentally, and also unintendedly led to the death of 12% of the Ukrainian population, but it's not genocide. Call it mass killings, if you like. So you begin to see the significance of this and why there's so much and most of the discussion around it. Another important issue, which will be very important to my argument, is preventing people from reproducing, especially on a mass scale, is considered genocide, and that's included in the UN Declaration and in later conventions, such as the Rome Convention. Helen Fine, who's one of the finest students of genocide, a sociologist who died just recently, notes that, and I quote, genociders might choose to prevent reproduction within the group or to appropriate the progeny in order to destroy the group in the long run. Now that's become very important in indigenous, in the charge of genocide among the indigenous peoples of North America. It's very much in the news right now, in fact, and there are horrible things done to children in forcibly assimilating them, and many of them died in the process. This is all coming out. The Pope, to his credit, has publicly declared that this is genocide. And so it's become an important issue right now as we speak, as the horrors of forced assimilation of Native Americans, Indigenous Americans becoming clear. The Canadians, to their credit, have established a commission on this, which has outwardly declared this to be genocide, not just ethnocide, as I'll get to. The editors of the Cambridge World History of Genocide, which just came out, maybe the most authoritarian, those authoritative, sorry, it's not authoritarian, I'm sorry, they were not like that era. I love, it's a great work, as well as earlier studies, which is the Oxford study, as well as earlier genocide scholars such as Fine have argued for a broader, more sociological conception of genocide, and while accepting the UN definition as an established fact of international law. And since, as Fine notes, quote, it is useful to maintain a common universe of discourse among genocide scholars, international lawyers, and human rights monitors. Fine's definition has been extremely influential, and I just read it. Genocide is sustained purposeful action by a perpetrator to physically destroy a collectivity or indirectly through interdiction of the biological and social reproduction of group members, sustained regardless of the surrender or lack of threat offered by the victim. And I have here, I won't read it, the Cambridge attempt at a broader definition. As to the essential features then, coming from the vast literature which I've tried to cover, is the situation now, and it's right now because, as I said, the Cambridge volumes just came out in 23. The essential features of genocide then become, number one, organized violence against a targeted group of people as such, involving mass killings on a large scale. So the question, how many must be killed to constitute genocide? You know, one can speak of a genocidal killing, where a person is killed because of the group to which they belong, as a genocidal killing, if you like. But the term mass killing is held to be important, with the intention of eliminating them. Scott Strauss, who's one of the editors of the Cambridge volume, with whom I've had a personal communication, who's very kindly read earlier versions of my paper, and had some very useful comments, made it a much better paper. Wrote me, said, you know, the attempt at group destruction remains the etymological roots of the concept and its central meaning. In a letter a couple of months ago. Now, it does not also necessarily include all members of the group, and many Jews, I believe, survived. Many Jamaicans survived. And another important point, which Fine is very good on, is that it can be protracted, extending over long periods. Genocide further includes forced prevention of reproduction. That's an important element, which there have been several other conventions, let me say. The Rome Convention was one important one, which extends the idea. Forced sterilization, infanticide, preventable high infant mortality, and gendercide. I'll get to that because that's an important one. But cultural genocide and ethnocide, that's an interesting, an important distinction. Claudia Card, the late philosopher, used actually the concept of social death. And in fact, I've been quite honored to see that quite a few genocide scholars have in fact used the notion of social death in their work. And Card went so far as to define social death as a critical element of genocide. And in her work, Genocide and Social Death, published in a feminist journal, by the way, and in which she has a centering social death accommodates a position controversial, she pointed out, among genocide scholars, that genocidal acts are not always or necessarily homicidal, and that social death, she argues, is central to the evil of genocide. You see, there can be many cases of mass killings. I mean, the First World War is just an orgy of killings, but not considered genocide. There are many other cases too in which people are killed horribly on a mass level, but it's not considered genocide because they're not killed because of whom they are as such, but for some other reasons, political or what have you. And Card has argued that the emphasis on mass killings sort of is sort of misses the central problem of genocide, which is they have to eliminate, to remove the social life and of a people. Seeing social death as the center of genocide takes our focus off body count and loss of individual talents, directing us instead to mourn losses of relationships that create community and give meaning to the development of talents. That what the Nazis were after was the destruction of the Jewish identity as a people, and that was essential to their relationship. Well, obviously, I was literally quite attracted to the idea for reasons of vanity, but as I thought more about it, it seems to me that it's hard to sustain, that physical death is central and just too entrenched. And so I prefer the distinction, which is evolved, and actually Lemkin did include that distinction of genocide and ethnocide, or what's more commonly called cultural genocide. All genocides include some form of ethnocide, but not all ethnocide entails mass death. And that's become a central part of the debate over the indigenous peoples, that in many cases they were not massacred, although there are many cases of real complete genocide in the UN sense of Native Americans, especially in California, where they are simply butchered in a way which leaves no doubt that this is genocide. But that for almost all Native Americans, ethnocide was the greater charge, the destruction of a people's culture. And of course, bringing kids, forcibly removing them from their parents and educating them, even if you don't kill them. And it turns out many ended up premature death. But even if they didn't die, that constitutes ethnocide. Genocide. Now, one important element of all this is the problem of reproduction. Gendercide, which in many ways is the worst forms of genocide today. The deliberate killing of individuals based on their gender. A woman, in particular, but historically males have also been involved. But now, it's amazing that I have to define what it is. It's the deliberate killing or prevention of birth of people. And the UN now estimates at a minimum that there are 140 million missing women in the world, gendercide. That came about mainly as a result of sex-selective abortions, with a preference for boys, made possible from the 80s by the fact that medical developments made it possible to identify the gender of the fetus. And in India, in China, in Korea for a long time, and in countries with minority populations from Asia, America, and others, there are clear evidence of genocide, and in Central Asia. But the estimate, the conservative estimate, is that 140 million women are not in the world, who should have been in the world, have been aborted because of their gender as such. And the question there is, does this constitute a form of genocide? Okay. So let me move on then to look at slavery and genocide. Most genocide scholars who take account of slavery, and many of them do, make a critical distinction between the two. That the slaveholder, however horribly he may treat the slave, and however many accidental deaths took place as a result of the punishment of the slave, that in the final analysis, the slaveholder's intent is not to destroy the slave population as such, or even because they are the group that they are, because their interest primarily in group is to exploit them economically. So it is not in their interest to kill them if the objective is to exploit them. You want to preserve them. That point has been made by several genocide scholars. For example, Kaplan, in her study of the Nazi Holocaust, the Jewish life in Nazi Germany, used actually the concept of social death, and argues that in the period up to 1940-41, when many Jews were, in fact, horribly treated, that between about the beginnings of the Shoah and 1940-41, when the killings began, what you had was a kind of social death. And she used the concept quite effectively in the use of Jews in the camps, the many labor camps and so on. Their deaths then, and many of them died from overwork, but was accidental to the interest which the Nazis had in exploiting them economically in the armaments industry and so on. That she considered social death. But after 41 or so, when the killings began on a mass scale, that's when genocide began. Very interesting distinction. And others have referred to that distinction too. Goldhagen, for example, it made the same point. I won't go into all the details, but on this, but that's become the standard distinction in these more recent studies. Hitler's building executioners, that controversial work by Daniel Hagen, also made that distinction, that the object was elimination of the group as opposed to the experience of blacks in Jamaica, in America, and so on, which was economic exploitation. Now, I've argued there's a too monolithic view of New World slavery in the recent studies which have come out, that there's significant variation in the fate of blacks among the slave systems of the Americas. Differences in residence pattern, the culture of the slaveholders, major demographic differences in provisioning of slaves, in manumission rates, very different, opportunities for revolt and marriage, survival of African cultural traditions, and in many cases what you had clearly was ethnocide, but that in some cases you had, I'm going to argue, genocide. And I look at the two, I saw paradigmatic cases here of slaveries in the Americas, Jamaica and the United States South. These are two plantation systems in the region, in the Americas. And one, of course, focused on sugar production, the other mainly on cotton, earlier tobacco. But fundamental differences between the two. And I want to emphasize that. Until 1776, of course, they were both also part of the British imperial system with slaveholder classes from Britain. The scale of ownership, very different between the two. The average ownership was about 10 slaves in the US per owner. In Jamaica, the average ownership was about 100 slaves or more on a typical large plantation. In the US South, the majority of people were free and white. In Jamaica, from the early 18th century, the vast majority were black and enslaved. The slave population outnumbering whites and a relatively few free non-whites by over 10 to 1. In some years, as much as 12 to 1. For the whites who survived the tropical diseases, Jamaica became a source of great riches, far beyond that of US whites. A fundamental difference between the two systems was the survival rate of the black population. In America, the planter class from early calculated that it made economic sense to encourage the reproduction of their slave population. A decision encouraged by the cheaper cost of food in the US, where there's a large free farming population and abundant land. As we'll see, the kind of crops they grew, tobacco and later cotton, also made a reproductive slave strategy more profitable. This is in sharp contrast with Jamaica, where the sugar crop and the slave trade led the slaveholding class to an economic calculation in which reproduction was seen as far too costly and was replaced by one in which young Africans, especially men, where possible, were bought from Africa and worked mercilessly with little concern for their welfare. Death was everywhere in Jamaica. As I showed in the Sociology of Slavery, and its sequel, its literary sequel, Die the Long Day. The physical death they tried to shun, the social death they could not. Now, I've used the term protracted or slow-moving genocide to explain the demographic and social situation of the black population of Jamaica during the period of British slavery, from 1655 to 1838. In the Sociology of Slavery, an earlier work which I studied for here at University of London, London School of Economics, somewhat similar to the protracted destruction of the Canary Islanders, which is now acknowledged as a form of genocide, by the way. And there's a very excellent chapter on it in the Cambridge World History. Between 1402 and 1496, the Canary Island culture was destroyed, wiped off the face of the earth. It's what a little known, but this is genocide on a scale which involved even more so than the Jews, in that they wiped out not only the culture, the Spanish wiped out the people. This is not a metaphor. With the data from the Atlantic Slave Trade database now available, it's possible to calculate more precisely the real death toll of Jamaican slavery by using a simple counterfactual strategy. Oops, I'm not quite sure why we're not moving forward here. Okay. All right, I've got it. So we need what I call a counterfactual strategy. This is needed to show what might have been possible, a counterfactual. Had the British in Jamaica not pursued the demographic strategy of buying, mercilessly overexploiting, and replacing their enslaved from the slave trade. The demographic experience of the ethnocidally enslaved North American provides just such, in my view, a counterfactual case. The distinguished American historian Richard Dunn has given us an indelible meso-level demographic analysis of these two, what he called radically different systems in action. Wherein the Jamaican planters treated the enslaved, and I quote, as disposable cogs in a machine, importing slaves from Africa, working them too hard, feeding them too little, exposing them to debilitating disease, and routinely importing new Africans to replace those who died. In contrast with the demographic growth of the enslaved Virginia. Now, to be sure, the Virginia slaveholders were no angels. Let me make that clear. For as Todman has shown, the reproductive choice was made easier by virtue of the fact that the crops from which they made their wealth was not sugar. That indeed, where they were sugar planters, and this is important, as in Louisiana, they were just as inhumanly destructive as their Jamaican counterparts, with similarly lethal demographic consequences, and relying on imports. And now you may say, where did the slave trade was over by the time they started expanded in Louisiana? Well, you had an internal slave trade. As the tobacco farms declined in the North, you had a massive internal slave trade in America. Many went to Louisiana sugar estates where they were cruelly treated. But in general, the cotton farms had a different economic sort of calculus, which in fact favored reproduction. Now, the second argument, there are two arguments against the counterfactual strategy I plan to use. My counterfactual is simply to look at what the situation is in America, which is a very good, if you like, idea or experience of what could have been used in Jamaica, and as opposed to what actually happened. And so what I'm going to ask is, what indeed would have happened had they chosen the American reproductive strategy? Now, two arguments against the counterfactual I'm going to present to you is that the environmental and epidemiological factors prevented such a reproductive strategy by Jamaican planters. That's one argument. It was just not possible given the tropical environment, the fact that the diseases led to a lot of deaths and so on. This argument was made by Engerman and others. Now we can dismiss this immediately with one word, the name Barbados. Barbados is a fascinating little place, and I made a lot of comparisons between Jamaica and Barbados because it's very enlightening. A very similar West Indian society, which did choose the American reproductive path. So what this point is important to illustrate that it is possible to have chosen the American reproductive strategy. Barbados did, and was very successful at reproducing its slave population. So successful that it was capable of providing other Eastern Caribbean islands with enslaved and ex-enslaved before and after abolition. There are so many extra blacks in Barbados that when the British captured or got Trinidad, after the Napoleonic Wars, and there's a large amount of land and so on available, they needed slaves, but the slave trade was already abolished. They tried to raid a Barbados, and the Barbados planters began to raise hell about it. So the argument that disease made it in part, Barbados had the same disease environment, same tropical environment, same growing of sugar and so on, but were able to reproduce their population, which shows that it was possible. So besides, the disease environment in the U.S. was not much better for the enslaved than that which prevailed in Jamaica, reflected in the fact that mortality rates were not very different. The second argument, that the American slaveholders were both more willing and better able to feed their enslaved because of their large farming community, while generally true, should be carefully qualified. And Tadman has shown that there are huge mortality differences. The differences, Tadman argued, was explained in terms of the extremely exploitative demands of the sugar plantation system, where more profits could be made by relying on the slave trade to both increase the population and provide more males and females. So the planters knew that the slaves were dying, okay? Now it was, here the whole issue of intent becomes very slippery. If you know that your actions is going to lead to death, can you still make the case that, well, they didn't intend to kill them, they just accidentally died? I mean, and you could use this argument, for example, in the case of what the Spanish did with the Tainos. I mean, Las Casas claimed it was clear genocide. Defenders say, well, no, it wasn't genocide. They died from the microbes, from the diseases. The Spanish did want their labor, But they didn't intend to kill them, but they died as an accidental result of their presence. So you get into some tricky situations here. Now, it's important to note that Jamaica was an integral part of the Atlantic economic system for the entire period of slavery and brought much of its staples and food from America. Remember, they're part of the same imperial system. This point is important. Additionally, profit margins in Jamaica far exceeded those of the American slave South. From Bernard's calculation, in the late 18th century, the wealth of Jamaica, the wealth of the southern planters, quote, paled beside that of Jamaica. The average white person in Jamaica, it's hard to believe, was 36.6 times wealthier than the average white person in the 13 colonies. Therefore, had they so desired, the Jamaican planters could easily have brought more food, as the Barbadians did, and other necessities to pursue a successful reproductive strategy, as to repeat, Barbadian slaveholders did, instead of overworking and overfeeding them. So in other words, they had the capability of reproduction. They knew the strategy worked, not just in the US, in which they're closely related, but in Barbados, in which they're very closely related. So they knew that that was an alternate strategy. Therefore, had they so desired, the Jamaican planters could easily have bought more food and other necessities to pursue a successful reproductive strategy, okay? As Barbadians did, instead of overworking them. On the evidence of the planters themselves, the cost of rearing an enslaved person to the age of 14 in 1831 was not much higher in Jamaica than Barbados. 112 pounds sterling, we have the exact data and all this, 112 pounds sterling compared to 109 pounds sterling in Barbados. Much lower than the other slave colonies such as Trinidad, where the cost of rearing a child up to the age where you can begin to exploit them economically was 162 pounds sterling. Okay? Given that Jamaica is over 25 times the size of Barbados with far more resources complementing the plantation system than in monocrop Barbados, and a much more complex system with a more rational, less blindly and deliberately exploitative strategy, it could easily have far exceeded Barbados and replicated America's reproductive performance. Okay? Instead, planter economic calculations resulted in a slave system where, quote, the lives of the enslaved population in Jamaica were, and I'm quoting Bernard here, which is now one of the leading contemporary students of slavery in Jamaica. The lives of the enslaved population in Jamaica were the most miserable in the Atlantic world. Now, when I said that in my book in 1967, people thought I was exaggerating, so it was good to see a contemporary scholar making the point. The lives of the enslaved population in Jamaica were the most miserable in the Atlantic world, especially in the first half of the 18th century, when the great majority of slaves were traumatized, brutalized, and alienated migrants from Africa. So it must be concluded then that the demographic strategy of the Jamaican slaveholders was one of clear choice. As a demographic historian, Kenneth Kipley notes, and I'm quoting, and he did a long, extensive study in Jamaica, as long as a master had control over a slave's life, he controlled to a large extent what he consumed, and obviously his physical survival. And as I was among the first to point out, and Kipley later specified at great length, Jamaican slaves spend their lives hungry and malnourished, on the verge of starvation, with numerous nutritional diseases resulting in endemic bone and dental problems, debilitating mood swings, pellagra, beriberi, due to widespread thiamine deficiency, dropsy, dirt eating, which was a desperate response to calcium and other mineral deficiencies, as well as just an attempt to fill their stomach from the fact that they were just empty. All of which weighed especially hard on children whom, the quote Kipley, malnutrition tormented twice, working much of his debilitating and often deadly effects through poor maternal nutrition before even touching the child via his own nutritional intake. This is reminiscent of the early concentration camps of Germany, such as Dachau, and the numerous ad hoc detention centers where malnourished inmates were worked near to death before the final phase of direct killings. We're right on here. We need to get back.
Oh yeah, from current slide. Let's do it from current slide.
Okay. There's a wonderful animation, by the way, done by the Atlantic Slave Trade Group, which shows the movement of Africans to the New World. And one of the things which that animation really shows is it's really quite amazing. The numbers of slaves going to Jamaica compared to the rest of compared with North America. Instead of the animation, I want to first of all show you this graph because it really is quite incredible what it demonstrates. It's the relative percentage of slaves who disembarked, of Africans who disembarked forcefully in Jamaica and in all of North America. The blue is North America, and the orange is Jamaica. And this is quite incredible. The numbers going to Jamaica compared with what became the United States. As you can see, just now remember, the United States is thousands of times larger than Jamaica. And this graph just makes you wonder what on earth is going on. Well, I can give you the actual data in a minute. So let's move forward. The figures. Do I have the two together? Shows the relative percentage of slaves taken to Jamaica and North America by decade between 1651 and 1830. So between 1651 and 1660, North America actually received more slaves than Jamaica, but Jamaica was captured in 1655 by the British, and everything changed. Between 5 and 10 times more slaves were delivered to Jamaica than to North America during the 6 decades from 1660 and the last 3 decades of the 18th century, and more than twice as many in the middle decades in between. And so let's move forward to the cumulative effect. This shows the cumulative effect in absolute numbers. So between 1650 and 1830, a total of 17,109 Africans were delivered in Jamaica, while only 388,232 were taken to North America. However, in 1830, there were over 2 million enslaved in America as a result of their reproductive strategy, and including freebacks, some 2.32 million black souls in North America. At the same time, there were only 319,000 enslaved in Jamaica, and all told, including the mixed group, 357,000. So what this astonishing difference amounts to is this. Had Africans and their descendants experienced the same rate of increase in Jamaica as had occurred in North America, the theoretically possible 1830 enslaved population in the island would have been 5.26 million, and its total black population, including the free-colored, would have been a little over 6 million, 6.09 million. Now, taking account of the 359,147 who were actually there, survived, if you like, this Holocaust in 1830, and using North American slavery as a counterfactual yardstick of what would have been possible, what should have been possible, what should have happened, what could we know have happened in light of what happened in Barbados and so on, what was known to the planters that they could have done. Okay, it's thinking about intent here, that this was a deliberate strategy, that they had the option and knew the results of that alternate strategy and chose not to adopt it. Instead, choosing a strategy with this result, and using, as I said, the U.S. as a counterfactual. We can say that there should have been over 6 million people of African ancestry in Jamaica in 1830. So, instead, there were 359 survivors. So the conclusion I arrive at then is that there were, in fact, 5,731,302 missing black Jamaicans in 1830. To express the matter in stronger causal terms of a counterfactual conditional, had it not been for the distinctive features of Jamaican slavery and the choices, the intentional choices made by Jamaican planters, 5,732,302 Jamaican lives would not have been lost. And that's a measure of genocide in Jamaica. This figure was not much smaller than the 6 million Jews who died on the shore. Now, let me just conclude. To be sure, there are variations of genocide. The British genocide of blacks in Jamaica took place over 183 years, rather than the 12 years of the Nazi Holocaust, and 2 to 4 years of the Ottoman genocide, by the way, of at least 1.1 million Armenians between 1914 and 1918. Furthermore, the fact that Jamaican blacks were not totally exterminated does not make their experience any less genocidal. As Lemkin pointed out in his classic statement, total extermination was not necessary for genocide to occur. Some Jews survived, some Jamaicans survived. You're looking at one of them. Lemkin also observed that genocide was best viewed as a process over time rather than an event. Also, Helen Fine and others. From all this, it is clear that what happened in Jamaica between 1655 and 1838 was genocide in every sense of the term. For what we find is both ethnocultural destruction, physical killing and brutalization on a large scale, and the denial of existence to 5.7 million souls. While both were genocide, there are three differences between the Nazi and the Jamaican genocide. The first is temporal. The fact that the Jewish social death, the ethnocide accompanying genocide, lasted for 12 years, between 33 and 45, while that of Jamaicans lasted for 183 years of deracination, the loss of connection with their past, of any recognized sense of any rights in or belonging to the land of their birth, to their children and parents, to their very selves and bodies. The second, already mentioned, is that Jewish physical elimination was concentrated over a short period of approximately 5 years, while that of Jamaicans lasted for 183 years in the drip, drip, drip of shortened lives and curtailed fertility. Lives that led one mid-18th century enslaved man, sometimes we do get the voices of slaves. This one comes from Thistlewood's journal, speaking no doubt for countless others to say to his tormenting enslaver, if this be living, he did not care whether he lived or died. The third concerns the nature of the elimination and is likely the most contentious. In the case of the Jews, and let me say the Armenians and so on, I'm choosing the Nazi genocide as a classic one, but there have been hundreds of genocide. Actual living bodies were destroyed. In the case of the Jamaicans, in addition to the abbreviated lives and outright murders and mass executions and suicides, and potential living bodies were preventively destroyed. Lives that would almost certainly have happened should by any and all human standards have eventuated under the quite reasonable counterfactual condition I've discussed. Now, as I've noted several times previously, both the 1948 Genocide Convention and subsequent reaffirmations make the prevention of births a central element of genocide. The absence of these 5.7 million Jamaican lives is not a hypothetical. It was a deliberate curtailment. Like female gendercide, the deliberate preventive obliteration of up to 150 million females, mainly through self-selective termination of pregnancy. It was not just a crime against humanity, but genocide. So let me end by considering the issue of intent to exterminate, which is such a central issue of contention. There's an important preliminary matter that is rarely discussed in considerations of whether New World slaveries constituted genocide. This is the fact that the case is usually conceived in terms of the descendants of the Africans who were transported from Africa, rather than from the perspective of the 12.5 million Africans who were forcefully brought to the Americans in what still remains the largest forced migration in human history. It's important to point out that this experience of being hunted down, captured, and transported under horrendous conditions during the Middle Passage is itself an unambiguous act of genocide, greater than any other in the modern world. Okay? So we make 2 points. I've been considering it from the point of view of the survivors in Jamaica who became slaves. But there's no question, just looking, and that we should consider the Middle Passage and the 12.5 million transport as genocide, given the amount that, by all estimates, for everyone who landed in the New World, at least 2 died. So we can assume about 24 million Africans died as a result of the Middle Passage. So from that perspective, seen it from the perspective of the Africans, that was clear genocide. And actually, there's some interesting discussion in the Cambridge World History, and a fine young classicist, Tristan Taylor, in his excellent recent study of genocidal episodes in ancient Roman history, makes this point very well. And a relevant passage, I think, deserves to be quoted. He's discussing what happened in Roman genocide. The fact that the Romans, he said, enslaved the population of these cities that survived the siege and sack rather than kill them, raises the question of whether the intention was to destroy the group as such. Although enslavement itself was not necessarily a past, the swift death in the Greco-Roman world, not all were sent to live short lives in the Lorraine mines. The impact of mass enslavement and dispersal of the population was as consequential as massacre for a group's elimination. Most would be dispersed to separate unknown fates in unknown destinations, as was true of the Africans, unable to continue the groups of which they were a part, whether Ashanti, Dahomin, or what have you, through both the prevention of endogamous biological reproduction and their inability to perform the various cultural acts constituted of the group's collective identity. In considering the convention definition of genocide, mass enslavement could thus be considered as an act that imposed conditions of life calculated to bring an end to the group. In relation to children, enslavement also involves their forcible transfer between groups, and indeed, as the entire surviving group was dispersed, endogamous biological reproduction was prevented, acts also listed in the convention definition. It cannot be doubted that the Romans were aware that mass enslavement would have such consequences, unquote. Nor can it be doubted that the British, French, Dutch, Portuguese, Spanish, Danish, and Swedish slave traders who transported the 12.5 million Africans and the Europeans who bought and enslaved them were aware of the consequences of their action and intended them to happen. The enslavement and transportation of 12.5 million Africans to the Americas was not just a crime against humanity, as the Rome Genocide Convention would have it. It was the modern world's greatest act of outright genocide. Whether it is called pragmatic or ideological genocide is a distinction which the descendants of this Black Holocaust are justified in considering spurious. But let me return finally to the matter at hand. Whether the Jamaican experience of the 1.07 Africans who ended up in the island and their descendants amounted to another outright crime of genocide. All the genocide conventions, starting with the UN Declaration, include the deliberate denial of reproduction as a group, to a group, as one fundamental element of genocide. As we've seen, the evidence is abundant that Jamaican planters intended to prevent their slaves from reproducing for 153 of the 183 years of British slavery. Only during the last 30 years did they try unsuccessfully after the slave trade. Okay. Marriage was forbidden, consistent with Fine's observation on rape, which she emphasizes quite a bit. as the critical factors in preventing reproduction. There's also the fact that this brought over, which was quite different and far more deadly, and had devastating impact on reproduction. The slave woman's reproductive capacity was greatly reduced. And we know that from Thistlewood's journal, that within 3 months of their arrival in Jamaica as a result of mass rape, all African women were infected with gonorrhea. The beyond problems of conception and reproduction caused by rape, other factors prevented reproduction. The shortage of women among the enslaved, since more men were brought than women. And the male-female relationships were devastated. Pregnant women were forced to work on most plantations right up to just before they were due to deliver. The planters deliberately wanted them to miscarry. And only a day or two after they delivered were sent to the cane fields, and their children left with old, incapacitated women to be brought up. And so there's horrendous mortality rate among children. So I'm saying this all amounted to protracted genocide. And Helen Fine is emphatic on this cause of genocide, which is an element of the crime, to use the legal term of the UN, which by its nature tends to occur over time. So to conclude, for 183 years, Jamaica had their ancestral memories and traditional cultures destroyed, their actual lives devastated, ruthlessly exploited, severely shortened, their bodies frequently lashed to the point of passing out and death. Their attempts at self-defense met with gibbeting, beheadings, quarterings, slow death from starvation while they hung from public posts to be eaten by vultures and wild dogs, their familial bonds shattered, their female bodies obsessively raped with impunity and infected with life-shortening variants of venereal diseases not present in Africa, their reproductive rights denied, their infants neglected, their children malnourished, naked, neglected, leading to the accumulation of 5,731 missing persons. And one can think of few more heinous cases of outright genocide. So, just a very brief coda. So, the island of Jamaica's never fully recovered from the uniquely violent decimation of that first half of its history. And it's exactly one half of Jamaican history was spent under these circumstances. One of the characteristics of traumatic memory, Dan Stone, the scholar of genocide, has written, is that it cannot be suppressed at will. And societies remain scarred long after its experience. The Prime Minister of Jamaica, Andrew Holness, in his 2021 Emancipation Day speech commemorating the abolition of slavery in the island, noted that it had been 183 years since abolition, and the role that the last great rebellion of the enslaved, led by national hero Samuel Sharp, played in bringing it about. But then he added something with which the entire Jamaican nation would have somberly agreed. Quote, "The use of violence has followed us from our history." Today, Jamaica remains one of the most violent nations in the world, as it was in the 18th century, one of the most violent nations in the world, with a homicide rate that places it in the top 5% of all nations, and a rate of femicide, the killing of women, consistently at the very top of the world's nations. A self-destructive pattern of gendercide directly inherited from the violent interpersonal traumas of the slave plantation. The dead yards of the nation's slums bear ghoulish witness to the plantation dead yards of that first half of the nation's existence. For Jamaicans today, the politics of post-genocidal memories, and I'm quoting a genocide scholar here, Dan Stone, the politics of post-genocidal memories are matters of life and death. The first half of Jamaican history has never been fully told. If the truth be known, it can never be fully known, because genocide, fast or slow moving, is existentially unknowable, unimaginable. As Ken Kiernan, one of the authors of the Genocide volume at Cambridge, points out, genocide has a way of imposing silence. We try as historians and sociologists to fathom and feel its horror, its sorrow, its unrelenting grief, its preternatural evil. But in its harrowing banality, to echo Hannah Arendt, it defies all understanding. Having reached the limits of historical and sociological understanding, I tried to imagine, after writing The Sociology of Slavery, that first half of our past in the literary sequel to The Sociology of Slavery, which was my novel, Die the Long Day, which drew on the materials I had collected here in London at the Public Records Office and the British Museum, to recreate in the novel a day of death and celebratory mourning, because the slaves celebrated death. They're going back to Africa on an 18th century slave plantation. And there's a scene in that novel during the mourning for the murdered heroine. An old Fanti woman, slightly crazed, wanders amidst the mourners, repeatedly wailing in a voice as dark as death, a dirge that was all she had remembered from her deracinated Fanti African past. And it went like this: do not say anything, O mother, sister. Do not say anything. For anything you say will be too much, and nothing you say will be enough.